My name is Andrew Penner, and I'm the president of the AEE Canada East chapter. And we're really pleased to have a wonderful panel for you today, focusing on municipal climate issues and strategies for addressing those. I'm going to pass the mic on to Anna Harmon, who leads up our CWEEL group, and she'll go on and introduce the panel, and then we'll get down to the important stuff.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Andrew, for the introduction here. I'm really looking forward to this incredible panel with seven incredible women. I, as Andrew was saying, lead the CWEEL division of our AEE Canada East chapter. One thing is you really do not need to be have an engineering background to be part of AEE or CWEEL. You also do not need to identify as a woman, so we welcome all, and we're hoping to grow our network through events like this. So please keep your eyes open for different events that are happening with CWEEL. I lead decarbonization strategy consulting with JLL, and so I'm really looking forward to speaking with seven incredible leaders who work with or within municipalities to solve climate-related issues. I hope that you all enjoy this conversation and are excited as I am. So I'm going to give each panelist a few minutes to introduce themselves and the work that they do, and then I'll be asking our panelists some burning questions on decarbonization and climate change. And as Andrew was saying, we're hoping to have some time at the end to answer some of your questions as well. So please ask those questions in the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to get to those. So I'm going to start off with Christine Tu. So Christine Tu is the director of the Office of Climate Change and Energy Management at the Regional Municipality of Peel, which is actually the second largest municipality in Ontario. Currently, her work includes guiding the implementation of Peel's ambitious 10-year climate change master plan. And she was also identified as one of the top 50 women leaders of Toronto for 2023. So Christine, welcome, and please take a few minutes to introduce yourself and the work that you do.
Great. Thanks, Anna. And it really is an honor and a pleasure to be here and seeing some of my favorite colleagues on the call with me as well. It really is inspiring to bring us together, and I'll share what we're doing, but I'm also really looking forward to hearing what my colleagues are going to share as well. So Anna, you had mentioned the region's climate change master plan. So that really is governing the work of my team, which we do have a dedicated climate team at Peel, and looking at both mitigation and adaptation, and pretty much everything in between, as well, as we need to move so much. So I'll talk about the plan since it's governing our work. It's a 10 years, so we have our 2030 outcomes. And certainly looking at our target of our science-based target of 45% reduction of corporate emissions below 2010 levels. So the plan looking at our corporate ways to also be prepared, but also build capacity within our organization, and dedication to transparency, to monitoring and reporting what we're achieving and when we're achieving it. Part of our audience then, like I said, it's mostly a corporate plan, but I will touch on how it's also enabling the community, perhaps either in this piece or when I answer some of the other questions. So who our audience is for this plan is pretty much all of our municipal services into public works, which is our operations and our wastewater, our waste management, our trans health, but also we also are parent health. So we're looking at how to decarbonize our fleet vehicles. Heavy duty is where we're moving into, so ambulances, garbage trucks, trans health buses. Also, focusing on really what's going to be enabling the electrification of our buildings, that's our other really major source of emissions. Kind of what we've been achieving on those lines. So we do report annually to our regional council on really carbon GHG reductions. For the past 3 years, we've been holding the line, if you will, against growth. So we're not as decreasing as fast as we can on everything, but we're also not increasing at this stage. And I think part of what makes our emissions inventory a bit unique amongst other inventories I've seen is we started to include not just scope 1 and 2 emissions, but also scope 3 emissions by looking at the vehicles that our employees are driving to and from. So from that perspective, we've benefited from remote working, which many of us had gone in quite earnestly during COVID. Some have, reduced their remote working opportunities, but Peel has not. And in part, that is in due regard for the emissions reductions that have been experienced. So that's something that we're looking to maintain going forward as a status quo operations. But what else are we actually doing? Because I said we're holding the line on emissions. And what we're looking at now is really how to build capacity within the organization to go to that next level step of implementation. Part of that is really looking at our policies and standards around our buildings in particular, looking at new buildings to net zero standards, which we do have now. And we're also now moving quite deeply into looking at retrofits and developing a policy and standard to guide to net zero at different stage increments. It's a lot more complex, as you can imagine, on the retrofit side, which I know we're going to get into a lot more. Part of that is really going deep into our existing buildings capital plans and state of good repair, and really unpacking what all that looks like from a holistic perspective. So we have been actually updating and rewriting our 100-year capital plan for housing and understanding the costs and timelines and what type of retrofits need to go first at a building scale rather than a piecemeal equipment by equipment approach for low carbon opportunities. Through that process, we've been able to identify really what needs to be done when, and it's now influencing our budget and our forecasts. And we've dedicated the highest investment towards decarbonizing our buildings. Last year's budget by $40 million, which is the most that we've ever done for buildings, and I think climate change kind of at large at the region. So it's really based on this level of detailed work we've been able to do. Mentioned that we are looking at our fleet electrification already, and then that's moving across all aspects of regions' fleets. But what I also wanted to not miss out is that the adaptation side. I know we were talking about decarbonization, but being prepared. We're going to be facing impacts that are not unavoidable at this stage. So we are moving forward with a very complex risk assessment for all of our infrastructure that we're looking at multiple hazards from a climate perspective. We're going to cost these risks, prioritize them, and again start to influence our capital planning on being prepared. It's a similar work that the FAO has done at the Ontario level for public infrastructure. So that's pretty exciting and important work on the adaptation side. And we're going to start to blend asset management with adaptation and decarbonization. So that piece is moving forward. And the last bit that I think is really important as part of our building capacity is educating our workforce. So we've got a 10-year strategy to engage the workforce on their role in climate change within the positions that they have within the region, because that is ultimately climate change is affecting everything. So I'll just plug, I'm doing a Cooking with Christine event, and we're trying to make it, engaging as well as, on the technical side. But so we'll be really emphasizing the benefits of plant-based eating and ways to stay healthy from that perspective as well. So we really are trying to do the hardcore technical improvements, but also look at the human and the people-centered part to be able to move the amount of work that we have to in the very short period of time that we have. So I'll stop there. I know you need to get to everybody else, but thanks for the opportunity.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Christine. I love that Cooking with Christine idea. Love to participate in that. So next on, I'm going to move to Erica Mayer. So Erica is the Manager of Sustainable Development Programs with the National Capital Commission. She is a sustainable building specialist with over 20 years of experience in the environmental sector. And throughout her career, she has worked as a liaison with industry stakeholders to help educate and enable action with a specific focus on climate change mitigation and sustainable buildings. So welcome, Erica, and would love for you to introduce yourself to the audience.
Great. Thanks so much, Anna. And thanks for inviting me here today. As Anna alluded to, my expertise is in climate mitigation, and I recently joined the NCC at the end of February. I actually wear a number of hats at the NCC to help move forward our climate action. One is on the corporate sustainability side, where we've got our sustainable development team and a climate action sort of group So looking at really what actions do we need to take both on the mitigation and the adaptation side to meet our objectives that are outlined in our sustainable development strategy, which our team is responsible for corporately. I guess the other hat is project support for a major development at the LeBreton Flats, which is a 29-hectare new development in the heart of the National Capital Region. And so it's, we're looking at developing that as a zero carbon community. And that first step here, we've got a few development projects underway, but also looking at it from an energy supply perspective. So district energy for heating and cooling all of those buildings. So I'm kind of involved in both at the project level and the strategy level, which is exciting. And maybe for those of you who are not familiar with the NCC, we're a federal crown corporation. Our broad mandate is really to build a dynamic and inspiring capital that's really a source of pride and unity for Canadians and really a legacy for future generations. So we are, our main mandate is the role of long-term planner for federal lands and the principal steward for nationally significant public places. So we play a development role. We've got a really complex and diverse portfolio of assets. So just to give you, I'm going to read these numbers because I always forget them, but we've got over 1,700 properties that we're responsible for. That includes over 1,400 buildings. Both a large portfolio of residential and low-rise residential building and commercial buildings. We're responsible for the 6 official residences. So this is, Prime Minister's residence, Governor General's residence. We've got 13 urban parks. We've got Gatineau Park, which is a 360 square kilometer green space. We've got a green belt, which is another 200 square kilometer park. We manage 300 kilometers of pathways, 125 kilometers of parkways, and 145 bridges, as well as the Rideau Canal skateways. So you can imagine from a climate, both on the adaptation and mitigation side, this presents a number of large challenges for us, which we'll talk about later. But just to kind of paint that picture, the other unique thing is that we also span 2 municipalities. So La Ville de Gatineau on the Quebec side, City of Ottawa on the Ontario side. So we're dealing with two provinces, 2 municipalities, as well as all the federal components. So just a little bit maybe about how our sustainability strategy and journey began. Our first, it started with our first environmental strategy, which spanned from 2009 to 2017, at which point we've kind of been progressing as moving forward. Then we moved into a sustainable development strategy. And so we've just wrapped that strategy was 2018 to 2023. So we're just kind of finished reporting out on that, and now moving into our 2023 to 2027 strategy, which will actually be tabled in Parliament this November. And the reason for that is that on December 1st, 2020, we were one of 2 Crown corporations to voluntarily sign on and become a legal designated entity under the Federal Sustainable Development Act. And so with this comes a number of responsibilities on the reporting and implementation side. And this has informed our latest strategy, which is coming into effect, which is aligned with the 2022 to 2026 federal development strategy. And so it responds to our commitments under that strategy, our plan does, and it also goes above and beyond in some other areas that align well with our mandate as the capital steward. So other things that we've completed in 2016, we did our first valuation of our natural capital. We did this in partnership with the University of Quebec and the David Suzuki Foundation. And so looking at what the economic value of all our natural and cultivated NCC green spaces are, and on average, represents $332 million per year. So looking at habitat for biodiversity, waste treatment, disturbance prevention, and all of this. And this was an important work that has affected and impacted the development of our strategies going forward. We're currently in the midst of developing our first net zero real estate portfolio plan. This will then feed into an overarching climate mitigation plan. And so as part of the FSDS, we've got a net zero emission target by 2050 goal, like many people. We're also finalizing our first climate adaptation plan, and we're looking to finalize that sort of in the first quarter of 2024. That work actually started with work on the development of climate projections, which we actually did in partnership with the City of Ottawa, who I know was on the call today, Janice. As well as then the step number 2 was to look at really conducting that climate vulnerability and risk assessment for the NCC. And given that we manage a lot of green spaces and infrastructure projects, we're obviously quite vulnerable to severe climate events and that. So the actions of, in that adaptation plan have been informed by both the projection side and the CVRA, and was done through extensive internal consultations. So, I'll talk a little bit about our net zero roadmap as we get into the questions, but we obviously have a lot on the go in a very complex asset group to manage and navigate through all the different facets. So.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Erica, for walking us through that. Our next panelist is also from Ottawa. Janice Ashworth is the sector manager for the private building section in the Climate Change and Resiliency Unit with the City of Ottawa. So with the city, she was a co-author of the Energy Evolution Strategy and now manages the development and implementation of the Better Homes and Better Buildings program. So welcome, Janice. Welcome to our panel.
Pleased to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here with these notable other speakers as well. As Christine said, it's quite an honor. So I'll give a bit of an overview about what the City of Ottawa is doing for their climate change objectives, and then kind of look forward to playing off the rest of you in our panel discussions. So the City of Ottawa has been relatively new to the climate discussions, along with the announcements or the commitments to climate emergency declarations in 2019. The city shortly thereafter started taking it fairly seriously and increased their staffing team and their complement of strategies and plans. So the climate change master plan is sort of the overarching document that sets the targets for our greenhouse gas reductions, both from a corporate, municipal level as well as community, and sets a number of other objectives as key priorities, including our climate resiliency strategy is the other kind of main notable one, and some community governance structures and so on. Under the first big action that we took under the climate change master plan, I'll just start with the targets. So the city, as with many of the other groups on this call, has set a net zero target by 2050 for the community as a whole, as well as a corporate target to net zero by 2040. So the municipal assets reaching net zero by 2040. And those are both in line with the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC targets that were set in the Paris Agreement. Now, I know that there's been some shifting since then, so there might need to be some updates, and we have committed to updating our targets every 5 years or so, but that's currently where they stand. In order to map a pathway to those greenhouse gas reduction targets, so the climate mitigation side of that master plan, we wrote the Energy Evolution Strategy. And that really looks at where are all the emissions coming from? What is the business as planned scenario with given already committed actions that the municipality is taking, as well as the different levels of government that they had committed to at that point, and sort of market trends. And so from that business as planned scenario, we then identified 20 key priority projects that we would need to invest in to move our emissions trajectory from where it was planning to be down to net zero. And those, of course, break out into 5 main areas, but predominantly in the City of Ottawa, as with most places in Canada, our emissions are sort of half and half transportation and buildings. So those are the big two. And then there's a little bit left over from the electricity sector, but not a lot in Ontario because it's a fairly low carbon grid. And a little bit left over from the waste sector, which I'll speak a bit to as we go forward. So that energy evolution strategy then mapped out our key priorities, and we've been working on implementation now and growing our team as a result. City of Ottawa now has about 25 people, I would say, working on climate change. So that's a pretty significant growth from where we started when I joined the team. I was about the 5th employee working on this stuff. And for a long time, there was just 1 or 2. So that's a good sign, although it's still relatively a small drop in the bucket compared to where we need to be and to where some of our leading counterparts are when it comes to looking at Toronto's massive team and Vancouver, of course, and some of the other leading municipalities. Ottawa, I would say, is trying to catch up. I should speak to the climate resiliency strategy. That is picking up steam, of course, unfortunately, with the motivations that we're getting from increased extreme weather events. Ottawa's become a tornado alley, in effect, and increasing floods, flood risk, and smokes from forest fires this year and ice storms have really kind of heightened the public pressure for adaptation. And so we're really seeing that pick up some momentum. As Erica said, we did the vulnerability assessment as the first thing, and now our colleagues are quickly working away on a full climate resiliency strategy. The first program that we have in place under that strategy is called Rain Ready, and it's really looking at stormwater management in key areas of the city where we have infrastructure challenges and flooding is a risk from stormwater. So that is underway right now, but we don't have a lot of other resiliency programs in place right now because we're still working on the strategy component. But that is happening. I'm going to speak in more detail to the mitigation side because that's really where I work. So successes to date, on the corporate side, we're actually on target for achieving our greenhouse gas reduction targets so far, which is great. And that's been achieved mostly through, the decarbonization of the electric grid in Ontario was a big help, taking the coal off the Ontario grid. That really helped. But also we've done some investments in our waste collection and capturing methane, and that was a big piece as well. And wastewater, we're achieving some interesting objectives or interesting outcomes from renewable natural gas, biogas potential at some of those waste collection, both liquid waste and solid waste. So that's a big component of the corporate emissions. We've also made a pretty big commitment to electrification of the buses in Ottawa. And as you probably have heard on the news, an electric train as well has been part of our investment package. So for better or for worse, that's now operational in the city, which has been great. And then there has been a commitment to converting the bus system over to electric buses, not quite in line with the timeframes that we had mapped out in our strategy, but at least it's in place. So that is good. Also, the small fleet, the other fleet, there's movement towards electrification of those, and we've got quite a number of Hyundai Konas on the road now for our paramedics and for our bylaw officers, and that's all working well. As I'm sure many of you are challenged with, the heavier duty fleet. Is difficult. So we don't have a clear solution. It's also really difficult. We're committed to new buildings being a higher standard. We're working on a retrofit strategy. It's not going to be easy. Buildings are a challenge, both corporate and private, of course. And that takes me to what I'm working on, which is the private building outcomes, or so the policies and programs that our city runs for private buildings. My team runs the Better Homes Ottawa Loan Program, and it's supporting elements. We have some incentives for heat pumps, for example, and for low income and affordable housing providers, we offer specific incentives. We're doing a neat thing called a retrofit portal, which will give every home a virtual energy audit and a label for it's energy and emission, that into things like realtor.ca and engage it with Google Sunroof, some of the solar potential data. We're trying to do some really neat sort of big data analytics to give advice. We run a benchmarking program for commercial buildings and offer a bunch of bells and whistles with that: education, capacity building, data analytics. My colleagues over in the EV side of our transportation side are doing some public EV charging stations to try to support garage orphans to get electric vehicles, so near multi-unit res buildings, for example. And we're trying to get through a high performance development standard to go beyond code for new buildings. It's been a challenge. I can speak about that more in the panel if we want, but that's still on our target, our work plan. And the even more difficult lift is going to be regulations for building performance standards for existing buildings, and that's something that falls squarely on my team. So we're working away on that, but it's going to be a long time in the making. So those are the kind of key things that we're targeting here in Ottawa.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Janice. There's a lot going on in Ottawa, as you can see. Next panelist is Leah Barry. So Leah is the climate change supervisor for the city of Mississauga. Leah joined the city of Mississauga in 2017 and led the development of Mississauga's first comprehensive climate change action plan, which was approved by council in December 2019 and is now undertaking the update to that plan as it approaches its 5-year mark in 2024. So Leah, welcome, and please take a couple minutes to introduce yourself to the audience here.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, I'm Leah Barry. I'm the climate change supervisor with the city of Mississauga. I work in a small but mighty team of approximately 10 folks. Our team focuses on environmental sustainability and climate change for both the city, so corporately and in the community. And we actually sit in our parks, forestry and environment department or division, which is interesting and advantageous, but also a little funny sometimes. So I led the development of our, the city's first comprehensive climate change action plan back in 2019. And I say comprehensive because it's a plan for both mitigation and adaptation. And it's also a plan that focuses on the corporation, so the city and our operations in the community. And so we've organized it into, we call them action pathways. We've got 5 of them. And within each of those, we've got corporate actions, we've got community actions, we've got adaptation actions and mitigation actions. So it's a very large suite of work. And, personally, and I dabble in the mitigation side and at the adaptation side, kind of probably equally, although perhaps a little bit more of a focus on mitigation. But month over month, year over year, that does change a little bit. So our 5 pathways are buildings and clean energy, resilient and green infrastructure, innovation and discovery, low emissions mobility, and engagement and partnerships. As I mentioned, this came out in 2019, and at the time our targets, which are still our current targets, is a 40% reduction by 2030 and an 80% reduction by 2050. And so that applies both corporately and to the community. In terms of corporate emissions, our most significant source of emissions is actually our transit fleet. We've had a great energy management team at the city, which is actually separate from our team. They sit in the buildings, facilities and buildings department, and they've been working for 10, 15 years plus on reducing energy consumption in our municipal buildings. And so I have to give them credit because they're the only reason we can report a reduction in our corporate greenhouse gas emissions, because they've been working quite diligently and hard to get our municipal buildings as efficient as possible. Although we're increasingly trying to switch that mandate a little bit, because initially it was really focused on cost savings. So therefore electricity, not so much energy savings or GHG savings. And so, they've done a lot of the work already on kind of making the best use of the electricity, but they haven't focused as much on the getting off of natural gas because the business case is a harder sell on that one. So we've been working really closely on that, and the narrative is we've seen major shifts in that already, which is great. In the community, we're actually a little bit different than most municipalities in Ontario. Janice kind of was mentioning that in Ottawa, it's an even split between transportation and buildings. But in Mississauga, buildings is our number one, well over half. So we're about 55% of our emissions in the community do come from our buildings, and that's all buildings, residential, commercial, industrial, whereas transportation is only about 30% of our emissions. So it's an interesting kind of inversion, or a little bit of a switch, because a lot of the times it's even, or sometimes transportation is higher. I mentioned that we can report a reduction, although I can't say that we're on track towards meeting our existing targets. So we've actually got, we can say we've achieved a 2% reduction corporately, and that's currently below our 1990 levels, although we are looking to update our baseline year to 2018. And then in the community that we've got an 11% reduction. Now, what I can say is that the trends since 1990 were a pretty steady upward trend. And then 2019, 2020, we started to, 2020, up until 2019, it was going up, and then COVID hit in 2020, and we saw quite a significant dip. So, we all know that 2020 and 2021 was an anomalous years, a collection of years, and really obviously changed the way that we live and work. And we know that as a result of that, and even Christine mentioned this at the region, work from home, a lot of people weren't on the road. So, great. And so that has resulted in a decrease in emissions, mostly transportation related emissions. Actually both in our transit and community wise, but trends are ticking back up, and it's quite worrisome. So indications are that, as of 2022, that's going to start going back up again as we kind of return to normal. So I think that's an important point to make. We know that we need to accelerate action. And we are also approaching the 5-year mark of our plan. So it was December 2019. And so somehow next year it's our 5-year anniversary, and so we've already kind of begun the process of updating that plan. And as I mentioned, we know we need to accelerate action, and also we need to accelerate our targets and have our targets reflect kind of where we really need to go. I mentioned a changing baseline, but of course also a changing target, and net zero being part of that equation. Luckily, we have some council direction. Recently, there was a council motion back in March that directed staff to report on, they're calling it a pathway report to net zero, and so we've been working on that kind of in tandem with our update to our plan. And my goal as I lead that process is really as we update our plan, is really to center equity and engagement throughout the development of this new plan. And I really think and hope that we can find, some clarity both internally and externally on our kind of collective roles and responsibilities to advance climate action in Mississauga. And, obviously, while we're doing all of that, we're still also busy implementing a number of different actions within our existing climate change action plan, and continuously engaging our colleagues and partners to advance climate action, and also trying to grow our team, which, I can't report the level of growth that Janice has, but we've got a couple extra folks on the team than a couple of years ago, which is great. And certainly we hope to see that trend continuing. We've got a couple of things that I can highlight in terms of some of the things that we've done recently, one of which is a climate risk and vulnerability assessment of our municipally owned assets. So we've done that, and that includes also a mapping component, and it's really starting to highlight some work that we are beginning to do but need to do more of around social vulnerabilities and its interaction, and how we can physically and geographically locate our programming and our prioritization of our capacity and our resources in terms of where in the community do we really need to focus our efforts. We're updating our green development standards, and
I'll give you one more minute, Leah, or maybe 30 seconds. I'll have to, just in the interest of time. Okay, perfect.
That's it. I was just going to say, we're updating our green development standards as a community facing piece, but we're also doing it, we already have them for the corporation. And so they came around about 5 years ago. So we can speak to that a little bit more. And that's it for me.
Amazing. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leah. So our next panelist is Megan Eastwood. Megan is the manager for planning and sustainability at the region of Waterloo. In this role, she leads a team of climate ecology, forestry, and cultural heritage specialists. Her current priorities include the development of a corporate carbon budget, corporate climate adaptation and resilience planning, and collaborative climate governance. So welcome, Megan.
Thank you, Anna. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today. So I'll try to be brief in my introduction. I know that we have a lot to get through. So echoing a lot of what we've heard from my wonderful colleagues, we're also trying to grow our team here at the Region of Waterloo. I'd say we're growing a little bit more slowly than others are. So congrats to those who have such big teams. That's very interesting and exciting to hear. I was hired at the region about a year ago from came to the region from the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. So my background is actually ecology and climate adaptation. So the world of mitigation and the energy transition is somewhat new to me, but I am learning quickly and have some great colleagues to work alongside. I was the first person at the region with climate in their title. We've now subsequently hired 3 more people. So we have a team of 4 people dedicated to the climate transition at the region. But we see ourselves as sort of a backbone entity within the corporation, such that everyone across our organization can see climate change in their job descriptions. That's really our goal. We want to have a very distributed approach to this. So that sort of guides the work we do. So my team supports both community and corporate action, as others have said. At the community scale, we're part of a really unique and I think amazing governance group called Climate Action WR. And so that's made up of the area municipalities, the region, and then other key stakeholders. And we work together to implement something called Transform WR. So that's our community climate mitigation strategy and action plan. And that sets out our targets. And so we have a 50 by 30 target as well as an 80 by 50 target. So similar to Leah, we will be revisiting this most likely. We want to align ourselves with net zero targets as well by 2050, but those are our targets right now. At the corporate scale, a couple of things underway. We have, not my team, but the larger corporation has just unveiled a new strategic plan, and climate action was one of 4 key priorities. So we were just thrilled to see that. We were hearing that from the community. We were hearing that from staff, that climate needs to be a priority, both adaptation and mitigation. Within my team, we are leading the development of a corporate carbon budget. I won't go into a lot of detail about that because you can look to great resources like C40 Cities, which is the method that we will be following. The city of Edmonton is really sort of the Canadian trailblazer with this methodology. Toronto is using their own similar framework. So we are testing that out using sort of a flexible and experimental mindset. We don't know if this will be a silver bullet framework. We don't think it will be, but it'll be one tool of many to help people conceptualize carbon a little differently, such that we see it for the finite resource that it is, and that we can develop some decarbonization pathways for all of our operating units across the organization. We're also in the process of supporting the development of high performance development standards or green development standards. We want to have a harmonized approach across the region. So all 8 municipalities will be working on this together, and we will implement the same standard, which is quite unique and exciting. It will take more time as a result, but we're really excited about the progress that will bring for both the energy transition and for resilience planning. And then finally, one of the initiatives that we're hoping to launch soon, this has not been approved by council yet, but we're hopeful that we can get it through, is something very similar to what Janice described, a home energy retrofit program. We will call this, if we're successful, we will call this Retrofit WR, and it will really model itself after the great work we've seen in Ottawa, Guelph, Durham region, others, some of the leaders who have launched those programs. And so there we'll have an eye to equity as well, such that we can ensure that low-income households are really prioritized in these energy retrofit opportunities. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Megan. Next up, we have Pam Cooper. So Pam is the acting manager for the environmental planning with the City of Brampton. She's a registered professional planner with 25 years of experience in land use, policy planning, zoning, project management, and public engagement with a strong interest in environmental issues. So the City of Brampton, Pam is helping to improve energy efficiency, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, ensure energy security, and increase resilience to climate change and protect our natural spaces. So welcome, Pam.
Great. Thank you, Anna. I'm really happy to be here today. My name is Pam. I'm the manager at the City of Brampton, and I manage a small environmental planning team. We only have 4 staff right now, and we're located within the Environment and Development Engineering Division in the Planning Department. So that means part of our responsibility is actually providing support for development applications through the review of environmental impact studies for any development program that might impact natural heritage features or areas or the function of that feature. Similar to Leah, we have some green development standards we called our Sustainable New Communities Program. And that encourages and evaluates the sustainability performance of new development. And that's a tool to facilitate and really accelerate the delivery of complete, resilient communities that address the climate emergency. And it's a point-based system, so development proposals can earn points for achieving specific criteria around categories like the built environment, mobility, natural heritage, open space, infrastructure, and buildings. Now, our team also implements special projects related to environmental planning, natural heritage, sustainability, resilience, climate change adaptation, and mitigation. So, for example, we know municipalities are at the center of sustainability efforts. And so we have our Grow Green Environmental Master Plan. And that is a comprehensive framework to improve our environmental performance and sustainability at the internal city level, but also at the community level. And that centers around 6 components of people, air, water, land, energy, and waste. We're doing pretty well with our metrics as far as natural heritage restoration and transit trips. There are some areas where we're still striving towards reaching our goals, for example, with car trips. So Brampton is a very suburban, car-oriented community, and right now a lot of people do depend on their automobiles to get around. But we're looking at our mobility plan to really increase active transportation and some other ways for people to get around and to lower those greenhouse gas emissions. We also have a community energy and emissions reduction plan, which is really my focus. And that works on improving energy efficiency and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing our resilience to climate change. We have actions in that plan focused on green communities, transportation efficiency, home and building efficiency, energy, industrial efficiency, and green infrastructure. It also has several priority projects, and one of those is the Peel Residential Energy Program, and we're working on that with our partners in Caledon, Mississauga, and the region. And that's really a program to provide residents with an opportunity to undertake energy efficiency retrofits to their homes. And we're looking at that not only as a way to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from buildings, but also as a way to have our residents save money on their bills, so decreasing energy poverty, and also just providing a more comfortable home for our residents. We are currently undertaking our first climate change adaptation plan, and so we're looking at upgrading existing buildings to be future-proof, but also planning for our new buildings to be low carbon and resilient. We do have a energy management division. They're not within our division, so they're separate, but they do work on all of our corporate energy and emissions for our city. And that's really important because Brampton is rapidly growing. We're going to increase from a medium-sized city with about 680,000 people up to 1 million. And so we know that our portfolio of facilities is going to expand along with that increased population. So we're looking at a zero carbon transition in operations for city facilities, net zero retrofits, LED retrofits, increased EV charging, and conversion from heat pumps away from that traditional HVAC system, and also having some new facilities move away from natural gas. Our transit division recently had their sustainable fleet strategy approved, which looks at fuel switching, battery electric vehicles, and EVs. And I'm happy to say that our procurement department has also just recently completed their sustainable procurement strategy. And so that will promote procurement practices that really protect the environment by minimizing resource use and reducing greenhouse gas emissions through procurement processes. As well, just in closing, we are the subject matter experts for any other departments and divisions at the city. So, for example, our planning department is undertaking the official plan review right now, and our transportation department is working on their mobility plan. So we act as resources just to help them to include climate resilience policies in those documents, and work with some of other departments, for example, stormwater management, who are doing projects such as bioswales and rain gardens. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pam. Last but not least, I want to introduce Amanda Christensen, who is an energy manager with the Halifax Regional Municipality. She's a professional engineer registered in Nova Scotia with over 10 years of experience working in the field of energy efficiency. She has been with Efficiency Nova Scotia since 2019, initially working as a project engineer with the custom program, and now in her role as an energy manager. So welcome, Amanda.
Thanks, Anna, for the introduction, and thanks very much for having me. So as you mentioned, my name's Amanda Christensen. I'm the energy manager with the Halifax Regional Municipality, HRM, here in Nova Scotia. I'm actually working in a role that's a partnership between Efficiency Nova Scotia, which is our provincial energy efficiency utility, and the municipality itself. So working very closely with HRM, but I also leverage any rebate programs and energy efficiency funding that we have available within the province. So I'm working to help execute a plan called Halifact. The ACT stands for Acting in Climate Together, which is HRM's response to the climate crisis. So it's an overarching municipal plan, like others. I think Janice mentioned a plan to get municipal-wide operations to net zero by 2050. It's a very ambitious plan, and we're actually trying to get municipal operations, so municipally owned and managed facilities, to net zero by 2030, which is my area of focus on the building stock within HRM, so our rec centers, libraries, fire stations, community centers. We're looking at a baseline of 2016 for those facilities and trying to achieve a 50% reduction in energy use over that 2016 baseline by 2030. So unlike some others, most of our energy use does come from the building stock within Halifax. We're actually closer to 70% of energy use is our residential, commercial, and industrial facilities. So there is definitely a focus on transit and fleet electrification within the Halifax plan, but buildings are the forefront and our biggest opportunity for energy emission reduction and GHG reduction. I'll wrap it up soon. I know we want to get to a lot of questions on the panel, but I'll also just mention from the maritime perspective, we're in an unfortunate geographic position here in Nova Scotia that we're really seeing the impact of climate change and more impactful weather events. And for us, that often means expensive weather events. We had a challenging summer here with forest fires that aren't normally a consideration, some historic flooding through the summer, and hurricane preparation seems like an annual event here. So really dealing with any climate adaptation, climate resiliency we can to address coastal impacts and other impacts here in the municipality. So thanks very much. Excited to get into the panel.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I'm hearing a lot of common themes here with increased risk from a need for climate mitigation and looking at a lot of decarbonization, both with buildings and fleet transportation. So looking forward to getting into the panel discussion. We have a lot of questions to get through, so hopefully we can do a bit of a rapid fire of questions. And if we can keep answers to around 1 minute, that'd be great, just so that we can get through a lot of these key topics. So I'm actually going to start with a question about the approach for decarbonization, your mandate of buildings, either buildings or if you're looking at fleet and transportation as well. I'm going to start with Erica, actually. So what is your approach right now for decarbonizing?
Well, I would have to say, I mean, I don't want to say it's a relatively new area, but I think in terms of formal planning around it, it's relatively new. I alluded to the fact that we're in the middle of developing our net zero real estate portfolio plan. So with a view to that zero emissions by 2050, we have a lot of buildings. And so we've really just started kind of phase one and setting that contextual gathering of information and survey of all our assets and what those emissions look like. We have a number of different building portfolios that we work with, and so each one is really unique. We have a large leased building portfolio, which is probably going to be one of our biggest challenges. So from an emissions perspective, it represents roughly 61% of our building emissions. And the amount of operational control that we have over those assets really varies. In that portfolio, there's also a lot of low-rise residential buildings. So this is going to take a lot of, we're probably going to see electrification kind of flow higher in the priority list compared to maybe some other measures, just because of the nature of the building. We've got a lot of buildings with heritage value as well. So approach to preservation also limits or can affect the measures that we're taking. But really, the real estate portfolio plan is probably, from a buildings perspective, is we see this as a really key piece that will inform specific actions and hopefully inform asset management plans at the building level for our portfolio managers. We see it as a key component to getting there. We do have some energy managers within our group, and we have done a lot of great work, especially around the official residences and other retrofit projects. So I think we're lucky at the NCC that we also tend to attract a lot of people that are inherently interested in climate and the environment. I think because of the types of assets that we manage in general, lots of green space, and so we've got a very receptive. Our colleagues are very receptive to climate messaging and are just kind of want to do the right thing. But first step is this plan to really help formalize it.
Amazing. And Amanda, is your approach similar? Is there differences that you're seeing? How are you approaching decarbonization?
So my main area of focus is executing our roadmap to net zero for municipal buildings by 2030. So we're really trying to tackle deep energy retrofits, a lot of efficient electrification in our buildings. We still have quite a few buildings that burn oil, natural gas, propane. Looking at energy persistence, we're developing a recommissioning and retro commissioning strategy for all of our major facilities with building up automation systems to ensure persistence of savings. Energy efficiency measures, obviously, to reduce our consumption in our buildings. Net zero new construction is a big area of focus, as well as a lot of solar power. We're really ramping up installing rooftop solar PV arrays on our facilities to assist with decarbonization efforts. We're unfortunately in a position here in Nova Scotia where our grid is still quite dirty. We burn coal, a fair bit of natural gas, so we'll need a bit of help on the grid side as we're electrifying our buildings. So really hoping that Nova Scotia Power follows along with our efforts to reduce fossil fuel consumption at the building level, and we see that shift in the grid to follow. But definitely looking at renewable energy on site as much as we can.
Amazing. Now, shifting from decarbonization to climate resilience here, Pam, how are you approaching climate resilience in your mandate of buildings, or even just in the municipality itself?
Yeah, in our community energy and emissions reduction plan, we had a key action, which was to identify opportunities to introduce new legislation, policy, programs, incentives in order to require implementation of climate resilient measures. So right now, we're working with the staff in the planning department on our new official plan, which is going to council November. And we've put some policies in place to state that through planning and development applications, we're going to require the preparation of climate change vulnerability and risk assessments that will be required in order to assess the potential impacts and risks associated with climate change, and also the appropriate measures to adjust the vulnerability of climate change impacts using the best science available. We've also put some policies in place to state that we will achieve sustainability in both the public and private realms. And so the design and placement of buildings is going to be considering sustainability by incorporating elements that improve energy efficiency, reduce GHG emissions, supports renewables, low carbon energy systems, and ensures the wise use of materials and resources in accordance with our sustainability and climate change policies.
Wonderful. And Leah, how are you approaching climate resilience in the buildings that you're looking at in Mississauga?
So right now, the focus for our municipally owned buildings is kind of being driven by our corporate green building standard. Within that standard, there are a few kind of resilience pieces. It is not, I'd say, the primary goal of that standard, and it's certainly an area of work that we want to be doing a little bit more in. So right now, there are kind of components that relate to backup power, and that tends to be one of the main ways there's a resilience piece kind of considered. There's also stormwater management that's built into, so on-site retention of rainfall there are requirements built into this standard as well. And there are some biodiversity pieces basically around kind of conserving and promoting native species and protecting habitats wherever they are, avoiding invasive species in the surrounding environment of a building. So those are kind of the pieces that are focused on from the corporate perspective. For buildings in the community, as we develop the community, the update to our green building standard, which currently is a voluntary standard. We have one existing, and it does largely focus on stormwater. But in the update, I think we'll see similar pieces also being included. But in terms of explicit kind of going out into the community and retrofitting buildings, we're really focusing on energy in the first kind of attempt at a home retrofit program, with a view to resilient retrofits into the future. But, it's definitely something on the docket for kind of future cases. And, we are a little bit we're certainly front heavy on the mitigation side in terms of a priority.
Yeah, makes sense. I think that's not unique to Mississauga necessarily. Now, Christine, I want to move over to you, and I want to talk about the biggest challenges that you're encountering in both developing and executing climate action plans. What are you seeing as those biggest challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I think many of the problems have actually been kind of raised out through the panel discussion, and I think there's been a lot of commonality on. There's many challenges. I know we're just to kind of make sure we understand the breadth of what we're dealing with, the complexity that we're dealing with. I'm just going to list what I've been hearing in this panel and what I've been experiencing as well from an implementation perspective. So themes that I guess and others may want to build it out on other questions, but we're hearing that municipalities here are looking at policies. Pam gave some great examples and standards for building development to hit our net zero targets, but what's lacking is that broader upper government framework of strong policy and regulation that would align with where the regions and municipalities are heading. There are at the federal as well, but we've got a government in the middle, and there's a really lack of alignment there and regulation on what buildings need to be, both new and existing, sort of connected to that policy issue and the framework issue that's not aligned. We've mentioned grid Ontario, relatively clean, but it is getting dirtier as we try to meet the demand and the load that we know is increasing if we are so many of us relying initially at least on electrification, transportation, and buildings. So to that point, there's also the grid capacity. If we're all moving in electrification, because that is the technology that is sort of closest to us to do the immediate transformation. So that's a big challenge on how we're going to do that, forecasting what that demand is. For each of our portfolios and projects, again, is a piece of work that Peel has now done for the buildings, and it's really quantifying the magnitude of the problem of grid capacity, and that's just the region's buildings. Looking at the community of that Leah is doing and Pam, that's a significant challenge. Needing to work with our utility partners and how that goes forward in a very complex regulatory or lack of regulatory environment. Sort of also then connected, I'm finding is with the piecemeal policy or regulations, some voluntary, some we're trying to corporately mandate. Really the accountability of who is taking on the risk first is unclear at many times in the decision-making process. So I'd say sort of generally climate governance can really move around, and I don't think we've landed on what is the best governance and how to be accountable. I think there's a lot of drive to be transparent, and that's coming through with the reporting and this disclosure. So I'm hoping that will be an element that will really push how governance is worked out, and where the accountability is going to be much stronger than I'm seeing it right now, because the decisions coming are going to have very deep implications, and that's where I'll move into cost. Can't forget cost. There's we've got plans. I know our plan is given a $400 million very high level to 2030, and that's just to do buildings and some of our fleet electrification. I know that other plans have also put this high level costs. We're now refining those costs, and it's going to be almost double what we thought that would be just for mitigation, and that's also driven mostly by buildings. We haven't even touched adaptation in the costing, which is what we are doing now through our risk assessment on what it will cost to adapt. So we know those numbers are really big. What we need to understand is when those investments need to be made, and at what and on what, that prioritization piece. Because I've learned that unless we can do that, at least at the Region of Peel, our budgeting process can't even intake these costs, let alone then how are we even going to discuss them? How are we even going to bring them forward in the processes that we have right now, so that they can be visible and start to be accounted for in very long-term capital planning, which is what we really need to do. So that's a piece where we're tackling that in the housing portfolio to break it down. But where I don't want to leave this challenge of the affordability of climate change is we also need to push the business case of the cost of not doing both the mitigation and the adaptation. I think there are wins and losses around discussing that triple bottom line, the other co-benefits. We're looking at really that mindset and cultural change that needs to happen in an organization to not be stopped by that initial capital cost upload, and really need to bring in that entire cultural change and shift to what really is at stake here. And to that piece, I would say the other challenge is I'm going to say, I'll put it as awareness or education or knowledge of this really complex issue, from high leadership right down to operational staff and those that are working with our most vulnerable to really embed what it means to move forward and commit. There is a large gap in education and that awareness piece. So if we're going to put it all into one big basket, all of those things are massive challenges. And then let's just put a bow on it and say the rate of change that we need to make it all happen is crippling in many ways to even start the conversation, even though we've been having this conversation, I feel, for almost a decade in my world, others more recently, but still very intensely. So I'll throw the last challenge to be up there in the way is, or not in the way, but the challenge is really sustaining very, very strong leadership to move us through. Highest political will, right down to those that are responsible for a project budget, is that leadership to go forward. So there's lots of themes in there, Anna, that others, if you want to dig deeper on or move forward with other conversation.
Yeah, that's incredible. Thank you. Thank you so much, Christine. Definitely the rate of change is a big one here that really requires that leadership, that strong leadership. So that's why we have all of these wonderful leaders here as well. Erica, is there any themes that Christine was speaking to that you would like to expand on, or any different challenges that you're encountering in developing and executing climate action plans?
Well, I guess just from, if we look internally at our own organization without even getting into, some of the obvious cost and implications, I guess there's two things specifically at the NCC that we see as challenges, and that's just system. It's more how are we organized, and not from a governance perspective, but just how do we do our internal planning and how can we streamline and align different aspects and apply that climate lens to everything that we do. And I know that, I think it was Megan that was referencing sort of having climate embedded in everybody's job description, which I really like. I think the same can be said. One of the big challenges for us is, okay, so when we're doing our funding applications, are we considering and integrating climate mitigation and adaptation strategies up front? Because we know that this, from a cost perspective and also from an implementation perspective, can really can help on the implementation side. And I guess as part of that is really we're looking to it's a challenge to kind of do everything, as we know. We're trying to bite off small pieces one at a time and really prioritize those measures that do more than one thing. So how can we look at the climate adaptation and mitigation measures that have co-benefits and move those forward at the same time, so that we can kind of meet multiple objectives with the same investment of capital cost and resources. So I think from a challenge perspective, really just looking internally at how can we better organize ourselves to embed these into our processes that we're already doing, whether it's building condition assessments or looking at replacement value and how is climate embedded in everything. I think that will help us with some of those larger conversations down the road. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Amazing. Thanks, Erica. Yes, that's a big conversation that I have with a lot of clients and internally as well. How do we embed climate change and decarbonization throughout the entire organization? So that's critical. Thank you so much. Janice, I'm going to move over to you, and I'd love to hear, maybe it's similar, but maybe it's a little different. What are the biggest gaps you're seeing in the market itself in order to really decarbonize and embed climate resiliency into municipalities? Is it this resource? Is it funding? Is it policy? Maybe from a bit of a broader sense too. What is, maybe if you want to give maybe one or two of the biggest gaps you're seeing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think if you were to ask private industry, they would probably say, give us money, right? That's sort of the typical response is we want grant money. And that's the hardest thing for municipalities to come up with the current conditions where belts are tightening all around. I think also, we're also seeing a big policy challenge between affordable housing and solutions, and that's been an ongoing theme, but increasingly getting traction with I'm sure as all of you are. And so we're kind of looking at how do we give policy clarity or regulatory clarity that will also help steer the market. And so that I think is also, some stakeholders are identifying that, policy clarity it would also be very helpful. And for some particularly challenged stakeholder groups like condominiums, where they're bumping up against all sorts of internal governance and financial struggles just based on their structure alone, they've actually told us, clarity on the regulation side, like some sort of standard would actually help them get the projects, because it would make it now part of their board obligations and no longer just a voluntary thing, but an obligation. What I'm hearing internally is, cities are being asked to either give out money or give out loans, and at least in Ottawa, there's a hesitancy to being a bank, for the city to play the role of bank. And I think there's actually good reason for cities not to play the role of banks, because we really need the banks to play the role of banks, of green mortgage products and green investment products. And if we look over the pond to Europe, we can see some great examples of where leadership from the private lending industry has actually really helped. And so I think we don't want to block by offering our own sort of loan programs. We kind of want to enable or leverage them to step into this space rather than sort of block them out the way that we're on the residential side. The Greener Homes program with 0% interest at the federal level makes it impossible to compete for the private sector, and municipalities are also kind of trying to compete with that. So my vision long term from that is municipalities playing the role of unlocking, unsticking, and supporting those who are the most challenged with creditworthiness or credibility challenges, but not providing the service sort of at scale, rather working with the private sector to do that at scale. So those are some of the challenges that I'm seeing or hearing, both from the industry and from internal stakeholders. at the city.
Wonderful. Thanks for that insight. Now, Megan, are you seeing similar gaps in the region of Waterloo, or are you seeing different pieces there?
Yeah, great question and a great summary from Janice. We are seeing similar trends here. You know, we have these competing, perhaps complementary, but some people see them as competing priorities between our housing crisis, which I know a lot of municipalities are facing, and an affordability crisis broadly construed, as well as climate. And sometimes those are sort of juxtaposed as, well, we have to address one or the other. And of course, that's not true. They can be deeply complementary. But when I talk to colleagues who are working in community housing, they say we need to get units in the ground right away. And if developers don't want to pay the added upfront costs of making these a passive house design or net zero ready, that delays. And then we are also facing pressure from the province in Ontario to build very, very quickly and build in areas that we had previously felt should not be built in. So managing those two crises, climate and housing, is proving to be very challenging here. The other challenge we're facing, both in the public and private sector, is that we've been very lucky in Waterloo Region that we have not had a major catastrophic event, and it truly is just luck. And so adaptation and resilience planning, unfortunately, is not top of mind in the way that it should be, and perhaps it is in, say, Halifax, who have not been so lucky. And my hope is that we can be prepared, and it won't take an event like that. You know, we have to talk about how can we fund resilience planning so that it's not just a disaster relief fund, but we are preventing disaster up front. And what we don't want to see happen is something like the great outcome in Peterborough, Ontario, where they now have a climate levy, which is outstanding, but they were hit by 2 back-to-back floods first that brought them to that point. And so trying to advance the messaging so that we can be truly proactive in the face of this, that's a challenge and a gap. And if I can just throw one other in related to, I guess, Christine's answer to the previous question, is how do we incentivize this massive modal shift? Because transportation's emissions in Waterloo Region make up about half. So it's a big part of what we're seeing on the mitigation side of things. And what we don't want to see is just a one-to-one replacement of ICE vehicles with ZEVs. And so we were talking yesterday with our area municipal partners, how do we get people into active transportation and transit when they don't want to be told what to do, when we don't necessarily have the policy levers that can drive that? You know, we're left thinking, do we need to be hiring behavioral economists and psychologists to help us incentivize that change in a different way? So I think that's one of the biggest things we're grappling with across both the public and private sector.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Megan. Now, one of the themes we've been hearing about is this need for funding, and that being one of the biggest gaps, one of the biggest challenges. Leah, would you be able to speak for a minute about how do you build the business cases to get funding to roll out these types of climate action plans?
Well, I think generally you have to be quite creative in some ways. I think it's, for us, we've found success in not just kind of putting forward straightforward, you know, we need X dollars and this is what we're going to spend it on, but to kind of try and connect what we're trying to do to as many shared objectives and to as many kind of shared program areas as we possibly can, to show that investment in the work that we're trying to advance is worthwhile and also advances many priorities at the same time. We're you know, we're doing some work right now, which is really interesting around kind of and aligning some things internally that you may not have thought ever to align. So the city's also undertaking a diabetes strategy right now. And so we're working with our partners over in planning and their academic partners to kind of say, well, you've got a list of, you know, what a healthy community looks like. Well, guess what? A sustainable community also looks like that. And so when we're trying to, you know, position things, we're starting to think about, okay, well, there's no point in, you know, one particular entity sitting over here in isolation trying to advance on an issue when, you know, the truth is there's multiple entities across at least our organization that are trying to advance on the same thing. Wouldn't it be great if we can align those and come together collectively and share the resources that we're all creating and the knowledge and insights, and then kind of streamline some of those funding requests, and so that we can leverage it to do multiple things and to advance multiple agendas. So I think that's kind of getting creative and looking for some of those unlikely allies or those allyships. We've had some success, and I think is potentially something that others should continue to consider.
I think that's really interesting, and that really kind of opens the eyes and speaks to how much we need to broaden our horizons and take a look at who's doing work that really has similar outcomes to what we're doing in the sustainability world, and how do we leverage that. So thank you so much for that insight, Leah. Megan, I'm going to come back to you with the same question. How do you go about building that business case to get funding to roll out these climate action plans?
Yeah, so there are some great resources out there that I'm sure many of us have seen. Christine touched on the Financial Accountability Office of Ontario. They have some really useful new publications where they look at essentially the business case for an adaptation-focused approach to infrastructure management. So they've showed through the modeling work they've done that in the context of extreme weather preparedness, taking a proactive approach to infrastructure management is just much more cost effective than a reactive approach. So it's purely just looking at it through an economic lens, and there's a strong business case there. Likewise, the Canadian Climate Institute has put out some new publications as well that build that business case, both on the side of mitigation and adaptation, showing that doing nothing on both sides is quite costly. So we've been pulling out sound bites from that and trying to insert them into council presentations and to sort of build that momentum in that regard. The other thing I think that's been helpful for me is using some of the language that comes out of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD. And I like that they conceptualize the risks there as both transition risks and physical risks. And transition risks are those that are associated with transitioning to a low carbon economy. And then physical risks, of course, are those that result from extreme weather events or long-term shifts in climate patterns. And when you start to use the TCFD language, especially with your finance colleagues, it puts it in their language, in their terms, and they can really see that good business decisions account for climate change, both on mitigation and adaptation. So I think using those resources has been great. And with TCFD, the CPA, the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, have some useful tools for municipalities to bring TCFD down into a municipal context. So that's something I would recommend.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Megan. Now, one of the challenges that I see is, how do we actually encourage buildings that you don't have control over? And I know we spoke about this briefly in terms of a lot of you having both the community responsibilities and your own corporate. So Christine, how do you go about encouraging buildings, and what are your recommendations for encouraging those buildings that you don't have control over to reduce their carbon emissions?
Thanks, Anna. I'm really loving this conversation, by the way. I've been taking notes myself and just kind of squaring some of my own thoughts as well. Where the region again has perhaps sometimes a lesser direct connection to growth in the community. We have our higher level policies, but where we've realize that we can have more tangible impact on growth and what that looks like. It's certainly leveraging policies of our area municipalities that are going strong with their green development standards. But we've realized that the region has a resource that can be leveraged, and of course that's our wastewater systems that have waste heat. We call it a waste, and we just dump it back into the lake. And heat transfer is 100% heat recovery is really where is a huge part of the solution. That helps us move into district energy opportunities and systems that needs to be part of that broader energy transition. So that we've really looked at ourselves as a resource provider, and have attracted a lot of interest from developers that also want to, their reasons may be their own, but part of those reasons is to develop their reputation as green developers. So working on that and leveraging those either early adopters or as we've all been trying to recognize the value and the opportunity that low carbon district energy offers in wherever there is either infill or greenfield development. So we are doing that in partnership with City of Mississauga now as one of our, I guess, our first out the gate energy resource, waste resource recovery, and to look at a new development down by our waterfront. So from that vision, really, of understanding how the energy transition needs to be rethought and redelivered, we're looking at our entire wastewater collection system and trying to understand thermal capacity, which we do, which we've modeled now, and we're going further to develop essentially a thermal. I'll call it a district energy strategy at the moment. Where we can see where we could tie in other systems. Also looking at where there may be within the community. We do have some heavy industry in our community across Peel that may be interested in dumping their heat into a system that they could then benefit from that exchange, and then we take that heat in and move it either upstream or mostly downstream in a collection system. So we're really looking to integrate to be part of that new energy systems that new development is looking for. And Pam may speak to the one of their last greenfield development. Are looking to not have natural gas in it, and potentially part of a waste heat recovery system could augment that opportunity. So it is going to require a completely different policy framework than we have right now. District energy, as an example, is not regulated in Ontario. So how do you become a thermal utility if that's what it is, or do you just be a resource provider? And there are thermal utility companies that we're working with or trying to learn from. We're looking across Canada for how these low carbon community developments that will affect the building's heat supply. What does that look like? And really trying to understand our role in it as the resources right on our doorstep, and that cannot be a missed opportunity.
Amazing. Yeah, thanks, Christine. Interesting standpoint from using district energy to kind of help encourage buildings and help move buildings to more decarbonized buildings. So Janice, moving over to you, how do you go about encouraging buildings that you don't have control over to reduce their emissions?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. I think we should chat offline about some of those wastewater projects we're doing. Is something similar in Ottawa with the demo site as the first of hopefully many district energy systems that use the sewer system as their source of heat. But yeah, ultimately, carrots and sticks are kind of the two common buckets that we think about in terms of how we encourage or require buildings to participate in the carbon transition. Some of the carrots that I kind of alluded to in my opening are, large data analytics to inform sort of virtual audits or virtual pathways to net zero. We're doing this both on the residential and commercial side. Both projects are still in the works. Nothing I can point you to on our website just yet, but coming, we're working with a group called Climative on the residential side to come up with virtual energy audits and energy and emissions scores for every residential home in Ottawa. So 350,000 or so buildings will receive, about 300,000 buildings, I guess, will receive a score and a virtual audit based on large data analytics. And then we're looking at a similar tool on the commercial side. We're actually working with a couple of different companies to try out a couple of different options. We currently have in market our benchmarking program with OpenTech, and that involves everyone who participates, which means sending us their monthly utility bills, will receive a virtual path or an insights report comparing them to similar buildings and giving as much insight as we can on how they can get to net zero. We, along with some partners, are doing some sort of testing or piloting work with a group called Audette, which is a bit more, using more sort of data analytics, looking at Google Street View data, Google Earth data, and a large, data lake of other energy audits that they've pulled, as well as the tax data to give the commercial buildings some level of sort of ASHRAE level 1 equivalent audit without having to invest any time or money or on-site labor to do that walkthrough. So kind of a neat new space that's emerging with increasing virtual tools and data analytic and machine learning opportunities that we're trying to tap into. We've also done some thermal scanning. So this was kind of a test thing that we did. We did some community scale thermal scanning, again, for the commercial districts or commercial sectors. just a couple of neighborhoods. We did a pilot. We're going to be doing a webinar in November about the results of that. And I'm happy for you all to listen in. But again, we're trying to figure out what can we invest our limited budget in that's going to help the maximum number of people to help, move the conversation forward. That's not just $10,000 grants for energy audits, because we've seen lots of utility programs give $10,000 grants for ash rate level 2 audits, and a lot of them are collecting dust. So we're trying to sort of do something different and innovative, and we don't really have that much money to give out, as I mentioned in the outline in the beginning. So we're trying to sort of leverage data tools.
Janice, I'm going to pause you here. Sorry to interrupt, but we've got one last question we want to get to, and we're coming up on the time. Just to make sure that we get through the last question here. And so I don't think we're really going to get to any of the audience questions, but I wanted to ask Pam briefly, what are the barriers in the way of you actually doing your job? How do you break down these barriers?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important to think about these barriers really as opportunities. So when you're thinking about something, for example, like climate literacy and awareness, not only in the community, but amongst staff, it's really about education through engagement. So we go out to the community, evenings, weekends. My team and I are out there in the parks, in the malls. We're there with our Grow Green tent. We did 4 engagement sessions just last weekend. We did a divide and conquer method. But I think it's important to speak to the people about, there's tangible things that they can do on their own properties that give them a feeling of ownership, and helps them, because climate change is a big issue and a lot of people don't understand it. And then when you're talking about staff, we've created an online climate change hub where we've pulled together tools and resources, and we've developed a series of webinars that staff can watch. Climate Change 101. What is climate change adaptation and mitigation? How do you understand climate data? What are some tools where you can integrate climate information into your city projects? And I think Megan had mentioned, it's really, every job is a climate job. So we should really be helping our partners in those other departments and divisions to understand that.
Amazing. Thank you, Pam. And maybe 30 seconds for Amanda to speak on some of the barriers that are in the way of you doing your job.
I'll keep it short and sweet, and I'm hyper focused on municipal buildings and decarbonizing. So beyond the obvious cost barriers and buy-in to really focus on these, we're just seeing capacity to execute as one of the main barriers. There's a lot to do in a very short period of time. So internally, project management resources to actually execute these retrofits and some of these energy efficiency projects, as well with our external partners, just consulting capacity and trades capacity in the province is tapped. We're growing rapidly as well. So there's a lot on the go, and we're competing with a lot of other major projects happening at the same time. So to try to execute everything we're trying to do in the next 7 years-ish is a big undertaking.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I could continue this conversation all day long. This has been absolutely incredible. Thank you all for your time and for participating. Thanks for all those that have attended this panel, and really looking forward to hopefully continuing some discussions with you in the future.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.